Well, to kick off, David, can I just ask you the only formal bit of our
Yeah,
conversation?
yeah,
Is
sure.
if you could say your name, date of birth, and place of birth.
Right. My name is David Piers. I was born in 1924, and I was born in London, not in the King's Cross area, in fact, but over Notting Hill Gate Way. And that's was my home and my working place for all my working life. I now live in the country, and having retired some years ago, and I come up to London only occasionally. I find it not quite to my liking, but I know it very well.
Take me back just before you got into the film industry, just a bit about your education.
Well, in fact, King's Cross does come into that because I was sent away to boarding school up in Yorkshire when I was about 9 years old, and the train always left from King's Cross Station, went up to York, and the school had the last three coaches or carriages of the train was dedicated entirely to the schoolboys. And it was, in fact, on one occasion in 1941 that we left King's Cross as usual, and we got up as far as Grantham, and a fire started in the coach, and it was disastrous. The train eventually came to a halt, but 6 boys were killed, and I escaped. I was very lucky, I escaped. So King's Cross has that memory for me, going back to 1941.
That's an extraordinary story. Do you know a little bit more of the background of the fire and how it started?
Well, yes, there's a lot of guesswork. I don't know that anything was formally agreed that this is how it began. It was probably a bit of a lark amongst the boys, and ended in a tragedy. As I've said, 2 of the boys who were killed were in fact the sons of the then Belgian Prime Minister, and he lost 2 boys on that occasion. Quite a lot of boys were injured, burnt and so on, and it was fairly traumatic, as you can imagine. Around in your teens to experience that was quite hard. However, life had to go on, and the war was on, of course, and that particular episode took the war off the front pages of the newspapers. And I don't know whether King's Cross was mentioned at all. I'm sure it was, because that's where the train started. And ever since then, I've been going from King's Cross Station up to Yorkshire because I had 2 sons and I sent them to the same school. So we used to take them up to King's Cross Station and say goodbye to them, and off they went. Fortunately, no repetition of my experience.
Out of curiosity, just in case, I would want to see those newspaper headlines and those. What date? Do you remember the date?
It was the summer term, and so it would have been, I would have thought, in July. Possibly in July, June or July, I think July. I'm afraid I can't give you the date because it's long lost in mists of memory. But I probably got the date somewhere, and maybe the day after the newspapers were running the headline of it. So that, if I can find the date, I will give it to you, certainly.
Any impressions, memories of King's Cross Station from that period? Just the feel of the station, the trains, the bustle.
It was an emotional time when one left to go up, especially when one was young, 9 years, 10 years old, and so on. It was emotional, and so I suppose one wasn't really noticing very much about the environment. It was It was a busy station, certainly. The trains were magnificent steam trains, of course. And sometimes if one got there early, one walked up and had a look at the engines and even talked to the driver and the fireman if they were happened to be leaning out of their cab. So it was, I suppose, romantic looking back on it, although at the time one was just curious. And actually the coaches were new at the time of the fire. They had a centre aisle. Up to that point the corridor was always on one side of the train, but on this occasion there was a centre aisle with seats on either side. And the seats were 2 seats joined together, back to back. And where the back of the seats met the side of the train, there was a triangular gap down which I suspect a match or something fell. This is pure surmise and I don't know exactly, but I think that's probably how it began. The master in charge of we had 3 coaches and I was in the first of the 3. This is at the back of the train. The first of the 3 coaches got away scot-free. The second coach was where the fire started, and the third coach, because the train was travelling at 60, 70 miles an hour, the wind was blowing the flames back. And the last thing behind the third coach was the luggage van in which all our cases and trunks and things were put. Fortunately, that coach, the luggage coach, was decoupled from the train. They had time, when the train came to a stop, they had time to take it away, so we didn't lose our luggage. But the 2 coaches behind us were destroyed completely, right down to the axles. And it was very traumatic. It was a nasty thing for the school as a whole, anyway. Quite apart from the individuals who lost their lives.
And that trauma must have gone on for some time.
Oh yes, some boys were taken away and given special treatment and so on. They were very fraught with their temper, and the parents too, as you can imagine, when they heard about it. So it was a difficult one. But the war was on, and it didn't hold the headlines very long because there was a lot of other things going on.
Exactly. And for the rest of the war, where were you during the rest of the war, from 41 through?
Oh, well, I left school in 42 and joined the army, and I was in the war from another point of view for the remaining 3 years of the war. So that's got nothing to do with King's Cross. I mean, this is another part of my life.
And tell me how you got interested and got into the film industry.
Well, I can tell you that very simply because my father was one of the early pioneers of the film industry. He joined it in about 1919, immediately after the First World War, and he worked in the very early days before sound came in. The sound came in 1926. He was in 1919 and worked in the film world for all his life. Well, in fact, I must include television, because when television came in 1953, 54, round about then, I'm talking about commercial television, because BBC was running television before that, but only for a very small number of people, because it was costly to have a television set in those days, and only the well-off people could buy them. So when commercial television came in 1953, 54, he then worked and, in fact, was one of the founder directors of Granada. So with his background, when I came out of the army, I said, well, what am I going to do? And he said, well, whatever you do, David, don't go into the film business. It's too volatile and it's a hectic and ridiculous business, and don't go into it. So I promptly went into it. And my son, my eldest son, is also in it. And my eldest grandson, who is 18 years old, wants to go into it. So if he does, that'll be 4 generations of our family name associated with the film world.
I must ask you, I'm intrigued. Before we get to the King's Cross bit, it's just is you in the pioneering days of the film industry. What was your father doing? What was his?
Well, in those days, you see, before trade unions came into play, and I'll talk more about trade unions in a moment, but you were head cook and bottle washer. You did everything. When the trade unions came in, you began to get job demarcation lines. And so you were an assistant director, or you were a property master, or a wardrobe mistress, or whatever it was. Whereas in my father's day, you did everything. He actually ended up as a director. I'm using the word director in a company sense, not in a film sense. A director of various film companies, and he'd experienced almost everything you could think of in the film world, from getting props, getting wardrobe, lighting, sound when it came in, the lot. But then when the trade unions started to flex their muscles, then that was all changed.
And you know, in those early days, in the late teens and the 20s, was he associated with a studio, or would he?
Well, yes, indeed. In Lime Grove, Shepherd's Bush, some studios had been built by Gaumont British. You see, Britain was actually lagging behind. Certainly lagging behind America in its evolution of the film world generally. It was slow to take off in the film world. France was ahead of us. Germany was way ahead of us. Germany was actually the best European country for film business. So England was lagging behind. However, certain people began to see there was a future in the industry. People like Lady Yule, and a man called Henry Boot, who built Pinewood Studios, for example, and also studios in North London at Elstree. But before those days, there were little studios around London. And in those days, of course, those early days, you had to have a glass roof to allow the light to come in, because there weren't big arc lamps and other lighting facilities. So you actually used the cover of a building, but you had to have glass so that the sun and the light could come in. And places like Welwyn Garden City and Isleworth and Twickenham and all sorts of places. But he worked in a lot of those places, and as assistant director. And in the end, in fact, he directed 1 or 2 films along with German colleagues who come in. Gaumont British, I mentioned a moment ago, obviously French, and they were a strong force in this country, together with the News, which was Pathé. That's French, also a French company anyway. So Shepherd's Bush was a very bad studio because it was vertically built, not horizontally built. So if you were working on the top floor, you had to get everything up to the top floor with enormous lifts, which took up the scenery and so on, and it was very uneconomic and very difficult to work in. But it remained a studio for many, many years, and Hitchcock, for example, started life there. He made many. My father worked with Hitch on many films, and in fact, along with Hitchcock, my father, and Sidney Bernstein, who was the man who started Granada, those three started a company called Transatlantic Picture Corporation, and they made several films with Hitchcock directing.
And what was your father's name?
Victor.
And take me, your entry into the film world. How did you start? Where?
As a T-boy.
Who for?
One of the rank, because J. Arthur Rank, who I haven't mentioned, but he obviously came on the scene and was a very powerful influence because of his money. And he started a little company called PFF, Production Film Facilities, that stood for. And he took what was a synagogue in Highbury and converted it into a small film studio. And it was the headquarters of what was called the Charm School. I don't know whether you know anything about that, but the Charm School was a place where young boys and girls who had ambition to go into the film world as actors or actresses, and they were given the basic training of how to deal with film acting in front of a camera. And it was called the Charm School, and became the subject of a lot of ribald stories and jokes, as you can imagine. And in order to give these young boys and girls a chance to try out their skills, if they had any, then we started, this company was started, PFF, to make B pictures, because in those days there were things called B pictures. And they were small budget pictures which gave an opportunity not just only for the actors and actresses, but also for technicians to learn their trade and so on. And I joined that company in 1947, when I came out of the army, as a T-boy.
And it was based in a former synagogue in Highbury. Where was it exactly? What was the address? Is the building still there?
Highbury Avenue, I thought, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know whether I haven't been back there for years and years and years, so I don't know whether it's still there.
Do you remember which bit of Highbury it was, out of curiosity? Was it Highbury Fields?
It wasn't far from the Arsenal football stadium, because I remember going to watch Arsenal play there. So I can't give you the exact address, I'm afraid. It was quite a wide road, and the synagogue was on one side, but it had been a synagogue. It was no longer a synagogue, obviously, when it was converted into a small film studio. It wasn't soundproofed, which is another thing which limited what one could do in it, you know. I'm sorry, I can't give you the address. I don't remember exactly where it was.
I'm intrigued. I must do some research. I'd love to find out a bit more about it. Do you remember some of the films that were made then? Titles?
Well, I can tell you, Diana Dawes was one of the Charm School girls. Anthony Steele was one of the boys. Christopher Lee, who eventually ended up in the horror, Hammer Horror and all those sort of films. Barbara Murray was a lovely woman, lovely girl. And I can't remember any more quickly, but those are the sort of people who were employed or given the opportunity to learn how to act in front of a camera. And Terence Fisher was one of the directors. He went on to work for Hammer Films, I think. Anyway, it was very good training, and I was there for 1 year. And then, unfortunately, it broke down. Financially, it was purely financial, I think, and they eventually decided they had to close the studio. It was also at the time when high definition was coming into, as a phrase that we didn't know much about at the time, but it seemed that J. Arthur Rank decided that he foresaw that there was a marriage, or could be a marriage, between film and television. Television was just, as I said earlier, a BBC, but it was going to come. And I think he thought that this was a possible way of combining what hybrid stood for and the technology, the future technology of the whole thing. He did have another studio at Elstree called The Gate, which I worked at one time, where a lot of experimental stuff was done with recording onto a sort of screen what the film camera was showing. It was an opportunity for the director to be able to see what his camera was actually taking, which was revolutionary in those days. So that today, of course, it's all computerized, and I wouldn't begin to know my way around.
It certainly at that period was again another sort of pioneering period in the industry. Obviously, you had the earlier period in the teens, and obviously coming into the 20s, and obviously the coming of sound. But certainly, that period is also a kind of very intriguing period in the film industry, and obviously new studios like Ealing.
That's right.
And how did you come to Ealing?
Well, the thing was that in order to survive in this very volatile business that my father advised me not to go into, in order to survive, one had to freelance. You never got a permanent job anywhere. So freelancing was really the only strength you had. And the more you freelanced, the better known you became. Because people said, oh, David Pearce is a possible third assistant director. And so one moved around wherever the jobs happened to come. And one of them, a few years on now, but one of them was an Ealing film called Passport to Pimlico. And I was given a job on there as a second assistant director. The second assistant director's main job, as it was in my day, was to look after the crowds, organize the crowds. Because in Passport to Pimlico there were large numbers of people. When I say large numbers, I'm talking about 100 or 200 people in the crowd thing. Today it's all done on computers, and you only have to have about 10 people. But
they were real people. If you wanted 100 people,
yes,
you had 100
people. And my job was to organize 100 people, 200 people, whatever it was, and then position them in the right place, tell them what to do, move, and so on. And that was the second assistant director's work. Passport to Pimlico was a great film, actually. It was fun film, and we shot it on a bomb site in Pimlico, very near to Pimlico. And Henry Cornelius was the director. He didn't make another British film. That was the only one he made, as I know of. Anyway, that's how I started with Ealing.
Coincidentally, that was the film that was available yesterday with the Daily Mail. I have it inside,
Passport
to Pimlico on the DVD.
Really? Yeah.
How funny! It's a wonderful film. I'm a big fan of this period of filmmaking. I think it's one of the great eras of British cinema, if not the greatest in some ways. And it was a sort of roster, a kind of and one after the other, a sequence of just fabulous films. It is quite amazing, the sort of legacy of Ealing, and you can just the quality. I think it's is it something to do with just the period it was being made, this post-war, and it's a sort of vitality, I just wondered, just your what you.
We're not talking very much about King's Cross.
No, not yet.
All I will say is that Ealing was headed up by Sir Michael Balcon. Mick Balcon was my boss, and he ran that place according to very clear-cut ideas that he had about. He was a very moral person. I'm using the word moral in the sense of, I mean, any sexual any sexual inclinations were stamped out. I mean, you weren't allowed to. You weren't allowed to show anything very much explicitly, and so but that morality applied not just to the sexual side of life, but to all aspects of life. So he was quite clearly the boss, and you had to jolly well produce the films or submit ideas for the films that he made, were made under him. They had to be very clear cut. Now, on The Lady Killers, just to give you one example, Bill Rose, who wrote the film based on a dream that he had, he woke up one morning and said, "I've had the most extraordinary dream, and I think it could be turned into quite an interesting story." This is the story, part of the story anyway. And he and Sandy McKendrick, the director, went to see Mick Balcon. Said, "We have an idea for a film, sir." And Mick said, "Well, give me a rough idea of what." So they told him very roughly the story. When they finished, Mick looked at them. They said it was a comedy. When they finished, Mick looked at them and said, "As I understand it from what you told me, there are 6 people in this film, 6 principal people, and by the end of the film, 5 of them are dead. And you call this a comedy?" Well, what he omitted was black comedy. But nevertheless, that gives you some idea of how Mick reacted. And they had to fight very hard to get him to make it, which they did eventually. And then the next thing, of course, was Katie Johnson, who was quite, I don't know exactly what age she was, but she was getting on. And they were very concerned about whether she could stand up to a 3 months, because it took about 3 months to film, whether she could stand up to 3 months of filming. And she had a big part, Mrs. Wilberforce, as you know. And they couldn't get insurance on her. And that was another reason why it might not have been made. However, these problems were eventually resolved. And I don't know the real answer to the insurance problem, but I think 1 or 2 of the Sandy and 1 or 2 others probably helped along in some way on that.
Do you know how long it was from, the moment that Bill Rose had this dream about an old lady being caught up with gangsters to the making of the film? In those days, how long from idea to, okay, let's go, let's get a team together and make the thing?
I can't tell you precisely the amount of time, but you can reckon that it would have been either immediately, because another scheduled film, for whatever reason, collapsed, went by the board, didn't happen, and there was space in the studio and people like myself and others who had to be employed productively. Couldn't be just sitting around on your fanny doing nothing. So it might have been immediately, or if that didn't happen, then it would certainly have to be slotted into the next financial year, because you've got a budget. Mick had a budget of so much, I don't know how much it was, but he had so much to spend on production for 12 months. And then maybe he made 6, 8, 9, 10 films in the year, something of that order. Some of them, like Whiskey Galore, was given its chance simply because it didn't require any studio space. It was all done up in Scotland, as you know. So therefore, it was a good film for Mick to have, because he could say, right, you go ahead and do that film up in Scotland. I don't want to see you in the studio for the next 3 months, sort of thing. So it might have been immediate. It might have been anything up to 6 or 9 months away. Yeah.
And do you know at what point it was decided to choose King's Cross as the principal location for the Lady Killers?
There were Jim Morahan was the art director, and he had one or two other people. Bert Davey was one of them in the credit list there, together with a location manager. I was a location manager at one time, not on this film, but on other films. A location manager's job is to go out and find potential venues that the director could be taken to with his cameraman and asked, is this the sort of thing that you think could work? Because if it is, we have to get permission from not only the local council, the police, but all sorts of other organizations that would be involved. And the director might say yes, and the lighting cameraman might well say, I don't think this is going to work for whatever reason. So it may well have been some time before a location was eventually found. In the case of Lady Killers, there were certain very specific things that were needed. The railway station had to be close at hand in order to organize the trains going in and out, not just to the station, but going in and along where the house was built at given times. It had to be therefore close to the station. It had also to have the railway lines visible close by, because of some of the action, particularly at the end, where one needed to see the actual lines, the signals, the tunnels, and all the rest of it, the smoke and so on. And if you think about it, there aren't any other stations around London that have those things. King's Cross was the only one. In addition to the railways and trains factor, there was also the streets and the gasometers we've talked about, which were all close to hand. So it actually almost gave itself to us without very much looking around. And then came the question of, well, can we get permissions, all the necessary permissions? And I had part of that as unit manager. That's part of my job, was to go and deal with people and explain what we wanted to do and would it be all right, and so on and so forth. And I can't remember any names or anything at this late stage, I'm afraid. But I obviously did go round to, first of all, the police, who I seem to remember were not terribly happy about it, because they just saw it as another problem for themselves in handling scenes that had to be shot in the streets, like the fruit cart, which was upset by the horse, and Frankie Howden making a fuss, and Mrs. Wilberforce, all those things. So it was not easy to get permissions, but in the end we did, and obviously one had to pay for some of these things. So all I can remember about the station and about the railway is that they were pretty cooperative. There wasn't very much problem there. Okay, we had to do things at a certain time because of the logistics of getting trains in and out and so on. But generally speaking, they were very cooperative.
And at that point of the sort of beginning of the production, um, did the writer Bill Rose, was he involved as well? Kind of in the as the film evolved, or was it? I'm just interested from he had the idea, the dream, and he kind of wrote the story. Was he involved in the process of making the film with
No,
Sandy McKenna?
no, I mean, enormous hours and hours and hours of talking before the cameras turned at all, between Bill Rose and Sandy. They would talk and talk and talk and talk, and revise and refine and change and so on. But once the shooting script was completed, then Bill Rose wasn't seen. No. He'd done his job, and I mean, he may have come, for all I know, he may have come, because in those days, the morning after the shooting day, you saw rushes, and only a few people were allowed to see rushes. And the director, Sandy obviously, and Mick Balkan would come down occasionally and have a look at the rushes, very often in fact, and ask difficult questions, and so on. I dare say Bill Rose was invited to go and see rushes from time to time, but not on a regular basis. So he was there, but he wasn't physically or visibly involved.
And the choice, the wonderful choice of Frederica Street as the
Yeah.
street with Mrs. Wilberforce's house. Do you remember turning up? Do you remember the street before
Yes.
the house was built? Do you remember actually seeing it and say, right, we're going to build a house there at the end of the street?
Well, I don't think I said that you can build a house there, but because that would have been the art director and Sandy and others. But I think once they said, this is the place that for us, can we get it? Then they turn to me and say, can we get it? So my job then was to go and see if I could arrange for a film crew to descend on this place and build with all the scaffolding up and everything that goes with building. And I can't remember again, I'm afraid, who I actually spoke to about this, but it must have been the local council people, but which department, I honestly can't tell you.
It was Islington, the Islington Council. It was just the Islington
Yes, right.
end of King's Cross. And what was your impression when you saw the street? What did you think of it? Because what is interesting, obviously, the street's no more. It's gone. It was torn down. But it's an extraordinary example, a classic example of a kind of old terraced Victorian terrace street.
Yes.
Sort of cheek by jowl with
Yes.
a railway bridge.
Yes.
It's incredible, really.
Yes. Well, it was built right up to almost the edge of the embankment, which leads down to the railway line, as you know. And the only thing I can really remember about it is that we had to have pretty well freedom to come and go along the street and park and turn around and all. So therefore, all the inhabitants had to be informed. And that was another of my jobs, was to go round to each house and say, this is what is going to happen. We will try and make it as easy for you as possible. And if there's any complaints, please come to me and tell me and all the rest of it. The one house that was nearest to our house, the Ladykiller house, as you look down the street on the left-hand side, the last house, there were some people in that house who I got to know very well, because they were very intrigued by what was going on. Well, everybody was very intrigued, of course, fascinated. And they very kindly offered the hospitality of their house to our actors, Alec Guinness and all the rest of them, to go and sit there. Normally we would have had a coach or a carriage of some sort, which would be a makeup place, a hairdressing, wardrobe, and rest place. And there would be half a dozen or more vans and trucks and coaches and things. So it would be taking up a lot of the street. And all I can remember is that the people in the street were very cooperative and didn't complain a lot at all. And this one house I told you, they were very charming, nice people, and I don't know who they were now. But they did allow us to go in there and sit and have a cup of tea and so on and so forth. It was very good.
And what a set! What a brilliant house that was built.
Yes, it was fun. Lopsided. Lopsided house, because Sandy had this idea that everything inside the house should be lopsided, should be out of kilter, should be not quite straight. As you see in the film, he always puts the pictures hanging on the wall slightly off centre, so he moves them an inch right or an inch left.
That's what Alec Guinness occasionally, you see him just move the pictures.
Yes,
Yes.
That was simply to give an idea that Mrs. Wilberforce was a character. She was a character. I don't mean that in the film sense. She was. What was important to get across about Mrs. Wilberforce was that she was very familiar, and everybody else was very familiar with her in the village of King's Cross. The village of King's Cross, when she walks down the street and she sees people with a good morning, good afternoon, whatever, and of course the police station knew her well, so, and were bored out of their skulls with her stories, but nevertheless were too polite to say, go. So she actually had to have a slightly fey, lopsided aspect of her character, but equally she had to be a very, very strong moral person. So when she discovers that they are robbers, she actually says, "You are naughty boys, you should not have done this sort of thing." And it was that attitude that she had which eventually brought the story to the point where who is going to kill her, and then it becomes black comedy, fully black comedy after that.
I think one of the strengths of Ealing films is the use of location. When you think of the Ealing period, you think of films like Hue and Cry that were made just after the war, that sense of the bomb sites of London and the young kids running around.
Yeah.
And I think why they're great, they're brilliantly written films and obviously fantastic, great actors, great character actors. But I think why we're talking about them 50 years on, and while people will be talking about them another 50 years on, is because there's something authentic about them. The sense of place. But they aren't these very studio-bound films. Some of them were, but there's a sense of, you really feel we're talking about this film being in King's Cross, but it really you can smell King's Cross. You get a sense of King's Cross when you look, when you see the lady.
Well, Mick Balkan must take a lot of credit for getting people to move out into the streets, into the countryside, and actually do what they would have done inside a studio with sets and so on. And he said, no, you can go out and actually film it as it is. And indeed, there are a lot of films that Ealing made. I was assistant director on the Titfield Thunderbolt, which was another one where we went out and we did it. Most of it, a lot of it, was done in the West Country near Bath. Certainly Hue and Cry, Lavender Hill Mob, and the Lady Killers. So it was becoming very much the thing to do, was to find a place, a location, which you could do not just one or two establishing shots, but you could actually do a whole sequence of the film story. And hence the building of Mrs. Wilberforce's house. And a lot of the film was shot actually on location. There were a few scenes, of course, that had to be done inside a studio, obviously. But he pioneered, very much pioneered this concept of going outside and doing it for real, as you might say.
But certainly the house itself, the set, is incredible. I don't know what it was like close up. Obviously, what's left of the film, the set is obviously what we see on the film. But what was it like just being standing next to it, standing next to the set of the house?
Well, it was probably a bit smaller than you would think. I mean, from the photographs, I mean, photographs tend to actually make people and places look a little bigger than they actually are. And although the house was perfectly in proportion and so on, it wasn't quite as big as it looks in one or two of these photographs we've got. Nevertheless, it had to be sturdily constructed because it had to stand up to the elements, and wind and rain and so on. It had to have parts of it which were dismantleable because the cameras sometimes were tracking into or out of the house. So there were certain parts which the art director had to design so that they could just be simply taken away, and you had room for the camera's tracks, because in those days you laid tracks for the camera, and it was a long process, and then ran the camera on the tracks. Equally, when you had higher angle shots, you had to have either rostrum, camera put on a rostrum. Incidentally, this was a Technicolor camera, as you probably saw in the photographs, which was 3-strip. The very early days of Technicolor, you had magenta, yellow, and blue. I think it was the 3 strips of negative in the camera, in the camera roll. So you had 3 gates, as we called them, and each of these strips of negative went down from the camera roll through the shutter. There were 3 going through at the same time, which, and don't ask me too many questions about this because I'm not a technician of that sort, but then you had your color picture, but in the 3 primary colors, and they then went to the laboratory and had to be brought into one, which only the laboratory could do, and sometimes it was very good and sometimes it wasn't so very good. So there's quite a number of sometimes retakes because the color hasn't gotten right. Wasn't Otto Heller was the cameraman, and he was absolutely brilliant, but he couldn't get it right absolutely every time, you know.
Otto Heller was German, Czech?
German, I think German. Yes, he spoke English perfectly, and with a small accent, of course, but he was very versatile cameraman. And there's that picture of him in the sitting down with grey hair. He was very good, very good. The man who was the chief cameraman at Ealing was Dougie Slocum, who was a marvellous cameraman, but and I think Dougie worked with Sandy on quite a number of other pictures, but not on Lady Killers.
What is also interesting about the set on Frederica Street is that when you look at Mrs. Wilberforce's house, you see the construction, but when you turn your back, it's a completely different street. If you remember, the view from her house goes down towards St Pancras Station. Mm-hmm. So you chose a completely different location, and you sort of edited the two together. It's a sort of completely artificial version of King's Cross, which is interesting.
Yes.
Do you remember that location as well? That was in Argyle Street, and actually I can walk you down that afterwards, actually, if you'd be interested to see the actual view from her house down to St Pancras Station, which actually hasn't changed at all.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know if you remember that. Do you remember much about Argyle Street?
Argyle, the name certainly rings a bell. Don't recall too much about
What you can see from there's a few sequences that are shot from if you're turning away from the house, looking down, and you can see it's terraced houses, and then at the end of the street, right at the end, is St Pancras Station. And there's a couple of sequences that are shot obviously from when the door opens and looking out. I don't know if you.
Yes.
If that's.
Yes. No, I'm sure that's.
It's.
That's. I mean, all of this is really saying that the location had got a lot going for it architecturally and atmospherically. A lot going for it. Not specifically because of the lady killers, but because of any film crew going there would actually see that especially Otto, Hello, Dougie Slocum, people like that, would look at it and say, oh, now that would make a good shot. That's what they were there for, to actually say. And so they would say to the director, can we get a shot, reverse shot, going from the door down the street? They would actually say that. And even though maybe there wasn't anything in the shooting script, Sandy would recognize that they had a point and would say, yes, well, I'll try and fix some bit of action to be able to show it from the other end, from the other side. Certainly he would do that. I mean, that's what location work is all about, is making the best possible use of it.
Absolutely, and in this case, it was perfect because what you see is that's the that's the view down,
that's right.
and you'll see that these are now all hotels.
Are they?
And these are all the Georgian terraced houses.
Yes.
And at the end here is St Pancras.
That's right. Yes, yes. Well, there you are. You see, I mean, that's a classic situation where maybe it was envisaged right at the very early days when we first went up there. I wasn't involved with the things like this because wasn't my job to say, oh, I might say to myself, oh, that's a good shot, but I wasn't. It wasn't for me to.
No, of course not. No. But again, again, that's the strength of King's Cross. On your door, just within stone's throw of the Frederica Street set, there is this other wonderful set which shows the other side of the King's Cross area. And actually, what we'll do, I'll go and grab the photograph that I sent you, so we can just talk about that.
I've got it.
You've got it here. Right.
I've got it here. Indeed. It's that one, and the other one is the robbery.
That's right.
This is the robbery. Clarence Passage.
And so the robbery was at Clarence Passage, and here in Cheney Road,
yes,
we can see the gasometers.
That's right. And that's Otto Heller.
So he's situated, just sort of kneeling.
And that's the Continuity Girl, as they were then called, Felicia Mannheim. That's the camera grips. That's the man who was in charge of tracking if the camera had to track. I can't see him. Let me just have a look at the. Have you got the list of the credits?
It's in that pile.
It's in that pile.
Flick through it. There we go. That's,
yes, there we are. Next page.
That's cast.
Yeah.
Often with these lists, you don't get a complete credit. It's as good as you get on these. If you
I know. I mean, I'm just going off the track a bit. Jim Clark, second assistant editor, he eventually became a full-scale editor and got an Oscar for, I forget which film it was now. So, Doc Matheson was the music chap. Chick Waterson, he's no longer with us, he's died. Camera operator, very good operator. That is Alan Bryce behind that's the clapper loader. He's just standing on tiptoe to see what he can see.
That's some glasses there.
And the camera operator, Chick Waterson, that's not Chick Waterson, no. Chick's not there. I think that's the one of the prop chaps, I think, prop man.
Right.
I can't remember his name, I'm afraid.
There's a policeman looking on.
And
there...
That looks like one of the chippies.
Yeah.
I would say he's a chippy, which he probably hasn't, and I don't suppose the name's here. But he would be part of the construction crew.
Right. And they're standing next to the Lion Swiss Rolls van.
That's me. Yes.
Is you?
That's me.
Yeah. Talking to a chap in the van.
I'm talking to the driver.
Yeah.
But that's me. Yes. I couldn't believe it when I saw that. God, dear, oh dear. Yes, I showed it to my family, or some of my family anyway, and they were intrigued because they'd heard about my film life, but they hadn't really seen very much about it when they saw this.
Yeah, it's a lovely shot, and what's wonderful about the photograph as well is because you very rarely see photographs of behind the scenes of the crew.
Quite so.
But you get a glimpse of the location, the King's Cross, the gas holders.
Oh, indeed,
and
the gasometers, absolutely marvellous. And there you see, there's your three-reel, the camera, that is normally that wide. There, as you can see,
the film
it's
canister
that
is actually three strips.
3 strips.
And you must, for the record, David, the gasometers. You told me on the phone the story about you sort of having to, yourself and Sandy McKendrick having to clamber up the.
Yes.
If you don't mind repeating.
That's in the book.
Yes, but
you may have read it. I don't know whether you have, but it's in the book about how shit scared I was, if I may put it that way.
Would you? I would be delighted if you could, for the record again, on audio record, tell me the story again.
Well, when we were walking around the location quite early on, and Sandy said to me, "I've got to get a high-angle shot down onto the streets," and I think that those gasometers might be the answer. And I looked up at them, and they were full, right up the top. And I looked at them, and I said, "Do you really think so, Sandy?" Yes, he said, "I do. Let's go up and have a look." Well, I had no alternative but to go up with him. And I hadn't reckoned on the fact that you climb up the gasometer, or you did in those days, by a small iron vertical ladder which is fixed to the side of the gasometer. And when you get to the top, it has 2 handlebars that just go over the edge of the gasometer. So you can hold on to those as you get onto the top of the gasometer. What I didn't realize, and I should have done, of course, is that the top is curved. Also, what I hadn't realized was that there were no railings around the top of the gasometer. So you stand on whatever height it was, 100 feet to 200 feet, I don't know what height it was in fact, and you stand on top of this slippery curved roof, or floor as it was then, and you realize that there's no rail around the edge. And if you should slip, you just go shooting over that edge, and that's it. Curtains. So I was absolutely terrified, I have to say. One of the half dozen occasions in my life when I really was scared stiff. And I stood on top of that gasometer, and Sandy, who seemed to be totally ignorant about this, had no fear whatsoever. Just walked around, went to the edge, went back to the centre, talking all the while. And I just stood there numb with fear. And then eventually he said, yeah, I think this will do very well. And so then I said, let's get down again. And going to the edge to get hold of the handles of the ladder took quite a lot of, I call it courage, but it was courage born of fear, because you were then right on the edge of the gasometer and you turn round backwards to go down backwards. Well, eventually I did it. And when we got to the bottom, Sandy said, yes, I think that will do quite well. And I said, Sandy, I am not going to arrange for a camera, Technicolor camera, 4 members of the camera crew, together with other people, to go up onto that gasometer for no way, no way. And I said, if anything happened, it would be down to us, and that's not on. So eventually he accepted the logic of it, and we got a cherry picker thing, you know, with a stand on. And he got up about 70 feet with that, and he got his high angle shot from there instead of from the gasometer. But I mean, there was no way I could get a camera crew up the top. It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. I'm not very good at heights anyway, but
it's great to think that you climbed up a King's Cross gasometer anyway,
yeah,
even if it wasn't used as a. The thought, just looking at the photograph of the size of the camera, it would have been virtually impossible to have.
Oh. No, you couldn't do it. But Sandy was one of those men who anything was possible. If he wanted it, he was going to get it, even if it meant killing half the crew, you know. But he came round. He realised, you know, in the end, he had sense. So that's my story about the gasometers.
But it's obviously that sequence, the sequence that is shot in that area is the robbery sequence.
Yeah,
which is
taxi and the car and the vans and so on. Actually, those were, so long as the police cooperated, which they did, to allow us to use the roads, and it wasn't it's the assistant director's job to make sure that people, passers-by and so on, don't get themselves into the picture. So that's their job. As a unit manager of a film crew like that, in my days, you were thinking and working for next week. You were constantly a week ahead, because knowing that you would want to have a cherry picker on Tuesday, possibly Wednesday, then that would be my job to organise that. So as a unit manager, you're not by the camera very often. Assistant director, you are always by the camera, absolutely linked to it. But unit manager, you're talking about next week. And so you just come back and say, yes, I've got this done, or I got that done. And Sandy would say, fine. Or I've changed my mind and I don't want it.
And in that particular location, which is now pretty much completely demolished, there's one wall left. It's virtually impossible to get there now because of the building of the new St Pancras station. But in those days, and in subsequent years, it was a very popular location for filmmakers. For you, you're a Londoner. What did you think of that area? Just like seeing that places like that, locations like that, which had the sort of those small streets off the beaten track, the gasometers. It must have been, obviously just as a location for film. Obviously it was lovely. But what did you,
Yes.
knowing London, it's even in those days, 50 years ago, did it seem like a throwback? Those sort of pockets of London.
Yes, but to think like that, you've got to be able to compare with something somewhere else. I mean, I've mentioned, I think, on one of our conversations to Marylebone, which I've always regarded. I lived there for some years, and I always regarded it as a village. Once I was in Marylebone, I was home. King's Cross, I think, had much the same atmosphere about it, and I would say that London carried, and still does to some extent, a lot of Dickensian flavours. The fact that there aren't a grid system of roads, for example, because that's how modern cities were built. Paris did have housemen to start it again after it was very much like London, but in fact Houseman was engaged by Napoleon to redesign. In fact, in London was also Christopher Wren was asked to redesign after the Great Fire of London, and he did produce plans, he and his colleague, but they were never actually carried out, and that would have actually brought into play a lot of straight roads going from St Paul's Cathedral to Westminster or whatever. But it never came about, mainly because the houses that had been on the sites, just like Frederica Street, the houses may have been burnt down in the Great Fire, but the people still reckoned that they owned the land on which their little house was built. So anybody coming along with a plan to start again with new streets, wider and so on, came up against an absolute horde of dissent about it from the people who said, no, my place was there and I'm going to rebuild it on that site, which was only 5 yards from the chap opposite on the other side of the road. Which, of course, by the way, is why so many of the houses in those days were built out on the first floor, not on the ground floor, because then it allowed the ground floor to have a street just a bit wider than when you go up on the first floor, they were butting out from the ground floor wall. But King's Cross was very much of that sort. I mean, all of the streets, okay, there were certain main streets, which I mean, it's Gower Street, I think, is that.
That goes more. That's more off Warren Street. That area is further down Euston Road.
Okay, well, Euston Road. I mean, all these streets are relatively straight, and whereas where we were, you got all these labyrinthine sort of passages and streets and so on, and it was very photogenic. But then again, the cameraman has a big part to play in the decisions about that, because he's got to make sure that there's enough light to get a decent exposure. And if you go to a too built-up street, then you may only have 3 hours a day of light which is worth filming in, and that is economically unsound. So you've got to go to a place that is both atmospheric but also gives you enough daylight to film in for 8 hours, if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly, it's a perfect location, and also the other thing is that it's a cul-de-sac as well, so you can do a lot of
Yeah,
work, and you won't have people coming and
that's right.
going. And
That was very important, absolutely. As I've already told you, there are half a dozen or more vehicles of one sort or another. I haven't mentioned the food side. I mean, that had to have been supplied. Um, Location caterers would have their own truck and coach and van and so on. So the road would be pretty full of vehicles, one way and another. And then, of course, if you had to filming from the house up the street, then all those vehicles had to go, and they had to be put somewhere else, which was somebody else's headache. I don't think it was mine.
Absolutely fine. Also, David, I've just wrote a few notes from our telephone conversation. Just there's one lovely story that you mentioned to me. Is about the actual the money in the cello case.
Oh yes.
Because obviously that's one of the the important parts of the film is the fact that the pound notes are stuffed into.
That's
the cello
right.
case.
That's right. In fact, Michael Burkitt was the third assistant director.
I don't think he's actually credited.
Yeah, well, he's on this list.
Right. Yeah.
He's a good old friend of mine. When we were talking about with Sandy and other people and about how much money could you get into a cello case, Michael, unbeknownst to me and anybody else, but he's told me this story since, went to his bank manager and said to his bank manager, because in those days I don't think there was anything more than I think it was £5 or £10 notes, but I don't think there was anything more than that. I don't remember £20 notes. Maybe I'm wrong, but anyway, he went to his bank manager and he said, "How much money do you think you can get into a cello case?" And the bank manager looked at him out of the corner of his eye and said, "What the hell do you want to know that for?" And there was a little banter went on. Anyway, it turned out to be £60,000 or thereabouts. And that disappointed Sandy because he wanted them to have £200,000. And it was a long argument about whether it should be some other, but it had to be a musical instrument because of the quintet that they, and in the end he settled for £60,000, which of course in those days was a lot of money. I mean, it may not sound so much today, but in 50 years ago, £60,000 was like talking a million. £200,000 was astronomical. So he couldn't get what he wanted, but the cello case took the notes, and he wanted real notes, not fake. And that actually represents a problem because the Bank of England would not allow you to photograph real notes. In those days, I don't know what they do today, but in those days you had. And I remember I did go I don't know that I went to the Bank of England, but I went to a bank anyway and talked about this. And it was agreed that we could have just the top layer of real notes, and all the rest would have to be fake ones. Not that they were seen very much, but just, So we did have, I can't remember how much, but a value, let's say £1,000 worth of notes lying on the top layer. But of course, they were part of the property department. Props looked after it. And the props were well known to be quite sort of clever gatherers of odd props that never were wanted again and so on. And so I remember having quite some fun with the property master, who was a good friend. I mean, we're all good friends, you know, and saying, and I think at the end of the day, we ought to count the notes, and the real notes, I mean, and make quite sure that they're all there. And then I will look after them overnight and then come bring them back in the morning and so on. And more often than not, we could never get the numbers absolutely right. There was always one or two missing. But I mean, quite honestly, I didn't take too much trouble about that. You know, that's life.
Wonderful. It's a lovely story. It's obviously the strength of the film. I mean, great story, location, the King's Cross location, but also the acting. You meant, you know, obviously Alec Guinness, and all, you know, Peter Sellers. I think, you know, it was one of his first major.
It
roles,
was,
it?
yes, yes. And you've heard the tape.
I have.
Yes,
I have. Fantastic. It's really great.
Yes.
Tom played it to me. It's
quiet. It's copying Tom Pevsner, who's another great friend of mine, who was the first assistant director.
No, it's lovely. It's and you know, was it as enjoyable to make as it is to watch?
Oh, enormously enjoyable. The biggest problem in many ways, which only came to light really in the studio and not so much on location, was that Katie Johnson, she may have been an elderly lady, but by George, she was professional and tough. And she had the ability to upstage Alec Guinness whenever they were in the studio set. Somehow or other, she managed to fiddle it so that the camera worked for her rather more than for Alec Guinness. And Alec got quite annoyed about this because he was a professional and knew all the tricks of the trade. But he met his match in Katie Johnson. And she was a delightful lady, she really was. And it was shortly after this film that my wife and I got married. And Katie very kindly sent us a wedding present, which I always remember being astonished that she would do such a thing. And it was very sweet, very nice. It was a little cushion or something, but it was a mark, you know. We got on very well together, and she was a great actress, but as I say, she was tough.
And the gang, you know, Peter Sellers.
Well, yes. Cecil Parker, I knew very well. He was a lovely man, almost too. He was a very good actor, but he was almost too nice to be in the game, in the film game. Herbert Lom was possibly the most difficult one of the lot. He had his own ideas. As for Danny, one round, he was exactly as you would expect. I mean, he was a large. He was very nice, but not endowed with the greatest of brains. But then that's not what it was about. He was just a big chap. And as for Harry, well, I think he learned a lot on that film. I think he was working with professionals like Alec Guinness and Katie Johnson and Cecil, and I think he observed and watched a great deal about how the professionals dealt with filmmaking generally. And after that, he went on to do the Pink Panther and all the rest of them. But I would guess that Lady Killers was his learning curve, I would think.
Mm-hmm. It was definitely that step from very I can't remember. I can't remember how many sort of minor roles that he'd had before.
Not
that.
many.
Not many.
Not many.
And it really was, and obviously quite a high-profile film. And I presume critically, a great success, and a commercial success and a popular success. The film, as were most of those films.
Well, no,
Really?
not financially. They were a lot depended on whether they got American distribution.
Excuse me. Sorry.
Don't worry. No, I was saying I think Peter Sellers actually learnt a great deal, and by not just his part, but by watching the other people he was with who've been in the business a long time and were, as I say, were pros. And then his gift for mimicry was in evidence with the tape that you heard, and that was really the first time that most of us had ever heard of him or thought. He was not a well-known person. I think his casting was brilliant, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised. I can't be sure about this, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised if Bill Rose didn't have something to do with that. I don't know. He may have done. Mick Balkan didn't want Alec Guinness to do the job. He wanted that marvellous actor. You see, my memory's gone, I'm afraid.
Alistair Sim? No.
Yeah, Alistair Sim, that's right. And he wanted Alistair Sim, and Sandy and Bill said, no, I think Alec Guinness would do it better. And I think they were probably right, although Alistair Sim is very good, but I think Alec Guinness brought the more black humour to it,
Were you all happy with the results? Do you remember seeing?
Oh, yes.
The film. When was the first time you saw the film as a complete film?
Oh well, I saw it at various times whilst it was being edited and put together, and I think I can't remember the first time I saw it in a commercial environment, but certainly at the studios I saw it. Although one was busy working on the next film, so, the king is dead, long live the king, sort of thing.
Was there a premiere that you remember?
Don't think there was. I think it was in December '55 that it was first shown. Don't think there was. It went down quite well in America, and of course there's been this other, which I haven't seen and I don't want to see, of the updated, they call it updated, of Lady Killers, which I think is a shame. But it shows that there is a dearth of good stories around. They have to pick up some 50-year-old story. However, it was quite well. It was well received. Most critics gave it a good write-up. One or two didn't. They didn't care for the black humour. I think financially it was all right. But most of Mick's films at Ealing were not great financial successes. And that's what brought about the closure in the end of Ealing Studios as we knew it. And in 1955, I was told that in a few weeks' time there wouldn't be a job for me. And so I switched my allegiance totally. I came out of the film world and went into commercials.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you very much for just sharing your reminiscences, and I think we've covered certainly the areas that we talked about over the phone, which is great. And it's very nice just to have it in your own words, some reminiscences about the making of Lady Killers in King's Cross, because as I said at the beginning, it is the classic King's Cross movie, albeit, you know, a chopped up version or vision of King's Cross. But then that's part of the fun. That's part of the film game.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't feel that I've given King's Cross enough attention in this interview, but I can only say that it worked perfectly for our purposes, absolutely perfectly. One couldn't have had, I can't think of anywhere else that would have done the job as well as King's Cross did it. So that is to everybody's credit who I dealt with. They were always very cooperative, and I think all the director, the cameraman, the art director, everybody was very, very pleased with the whole setup and how it worked. So that was wonderful. You can't say that on all. I've been on locations where sometimes things just don't go right from word go, and you're in a hell of a mess. But for Lady Killers, it was right.
The other thing, just the final thing, is also the music. You know, one of the nice touches of Lady Killers is the music, is the score, and obviously the record playing and
Boccherini. Yes.
A nice touch.
Well, I can't say too much about that. It wasn't really my scene, the music side of life. Obviously, the Doc Matheson, who was in charge of music, and in fact, the girl I married, I told you a moment ago, was Doc Matheson's assistant. So that's how that came about, and they obviously had to find something that was capable for a quintet, not a quartet, but a quintet, and it had to be something that everybody could sort of identify with, and that was not too way out, but at the same time classical, because the juxtaposition of these rough robbers, a gang with rather high-blown music, you know, that sort of relationship was all part of Sandy's thinking. I can't tell you much more about that. It worked very well indeed, I think, anyway.
What do you think that McKendrick brought to the Lady Killers? Because he is one of the great directors and didn't make that many films, but his films are nuggets. Really. What was there? Is there any?
He's written a book, of course, which you may know of, about the technique of directing, and it's pretty complex stuff. What Sandy was in advertising, and the first day I ever worked with him, which I think must have been on The Man in the White Suit, because I was his assistant on that, and I didn't really, this was a new man who just arrived, and I didn't know much about him. And the first day I went on to the floor, to the studio floor, and there was a blackboard on an easel. And attached to the blackboard was a flip chart. And I lifted this up, and there was drawn in black crayon a picture of what Sandy was going to shoot that morning. And I looked at it and I thought, good heavens. And I had a number of questions I was going to ask him, but the answers were all in the drawing. And I went to see him. I said to him, what is this? And he said, well, this is how I used to. He was not a copywriter. He was an artist in advertising, J. Walter Thompson. And they used to draw almost every frame of a cine. It would be drawn out on a piece of paper, not only for themselves, but for the client, the advertiser, who wanted to see what was going to happen. And Sandy just transferred this from the advertising world into the feature film world and did it every morning. We would come down, and so after a while, everybody would go and look at the flip chart and say, oh, yes, we need tracks for this, because he'd draw where the camera was and so on. And it was a wonderful, wonderful guide and help to all of us, especially me as assistant director, trying to get, first of all, I mean, for example, I mean, the cast, there may be 5 or 6 people in appearing the next day in front of the camera. A, B, C, and D. A and B had to be there at 8:30. C didn't have to be there till 11, and D didn't have to be there until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I was able to then organize makeup, hairdressing, wardrobe, and all the rest of it to suit that. Otherwise, you would get them all in at 8 o'clock, and they'd be blowing their heads off because they're sitting around waiting, doing nothing. So those sort of things are purely administrative, but nevertheless very important, getting them right. And Sandy did that with his drawings, and they were of immense help, great value.
And did he use those drawings for the Lady Killers as well?
Oh yes, we had them for the Lady Killers. Very often out at the end of in the house, you know, he'd put them up in the house, and anybody could go and see what, in fact, he wanted to shoot. Of course, sometimes it wasn't always possible to do them exactly as he'd drawn them. You had to take that into account. But it was a great help, and especially to his assistant, who was able, as I've just explained, to make sure that the artists, who were fairly temperamental, and they needed to be looked after, you know.
I know, it's quite a bunch there, quite a bunch of...
Oh yes.
You know,
yes.
That's quite a cast. And, you know, I can imagine in a small set,
Indeed.
they could
Indeed.
There could be eruptions, or they could be
absolutely. And then, you know, where is the camera, and where am I? So you always get just one side of it, especially with the ladies. They always say, "Well, this is my best side." You know, this is my best side, but you're always filming me from their side. Those sort of things. Madness. Mad world.
Yep. And you know, Lady Killers is a great example of that. So that's lovely. David, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.